Welcome to the Creating Wealth Show with Jason Hartman. You're about to learn a new slant on investing, some exciting techniques, and fresh new approaches to the world's most historically proven asset class that will enable you to create more wealth and freedom than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine self-made multimillionaire who's actually been there and done it. He's a successful investor, lender, developer, and entrepreneur who's owned properties in 11 states, had hundreds of tenants, and been involved in thousands of real estate transactions. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to your financial independence day. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
Greetings from Germany. This is your host, Jason Hartman, with episode 1030. Thank you so much for joining me today. It is about 11 p.m. here, and I am on a cruise ship. Yes, I'm just about to embark on a river cruise for the next week or so, and I will let you know about it along the way. Gives me a good time to study and just do a little research and all the stuff I like doing for you, because I am here to provide you with information to make good investment decisions, and maybe more than good investment decisions, hopefully, maybe just good decisions in general. Today is a 10th episode show where we talk about something of general interest, and our guest today will be talking about the Pope and the Caring Society. Hey, we've never done a show before about the Pope, right? There's a new one for you. And no, I am not Catholic. But yeah, we're going to talk about the Pope. This Pope that we have now is pretty modern kind of dude. Boy, you're describing the Pope as a dude. I don't know if I can listen to this show anymore. Well, anyway, we'll get into that in just a moment. We'll let our guests cover the Pope and the Caring Society and talk a little bit more about that. But before we do, there are signs out there, folks. There are signs. Signs. And what do those signs tell us? What do they indicate? Well, you know, there are some signs that there may be some trouble ahead. And I talked a few weeks ago about preparing for the next recession. Yes, preparing for the next recession. I'm not saying that there is trouble ahead. I think it's a little early to be predicting trouble ahead. However, we are going to have one of our former investment counselors come on the show here, either the next episode or maybe the episode after that, and talk about the high-end real estate markets in Orange County, California, where I'm from, and I spent many, many years as a very successful and very well-respected, I might add, real estate agent, brokering properties in beautiful Orange County, Orange on the Riviera, as they call it. Sometimes, I don't know if anybody calls it that anymore, but I'm still going to call it that. Glad I don't live there, I must say, because, hey, I don't want to pay the taxes and put up with all of the other problems California has, but I know a lot of you still live there, and you want to know about the market. I think it's an indicator of the market in general. You know, you look at what's going on in Orange County, that's the one example. We will talk about that here very soon. You look at what's going on in New York City. You look at what's going on. Hey, I just left Italy, right? Italy, what a disaster that country is. Oh, my God. Boy, you know, Spain, Italy, Portugal, of course, Greece, all on the verge of collapse. And now these Italian bonds may indicate some significant impact on the global economy. We'll see. And, you know, when you look at the higher-priced real estate markets around the country, around the world, are we seeing a real indicator of a problem? Is it just a temporary thing? There is a slowdown. I mean, inventory is stacking up. Time on market is increasing pretty dramatically in many places. Now, does this just mean maybe they just overbuilt that market? There's just too much high-end stuff out there? Or are the high-end buyers just kind of saturated? They don't need any more high-end houses. Are they resisting because of the prices? The prices are just too darn high. Remember that crazy guy? The rent is too damn high. I don't know. We'll see. We'll explore that, and we will see. But, interesting, speaking of, this isn't the real high-end market, but hey, you probably saw it in the news, but the Brady Bunch house is for sale. Yes, the Brady Bunch house is for sale. Now, instantly, your skeptical host, your consumer advocate host, your cynical host, your legal activist host, your let's out the centralized banking system host, when he saw this thing about the Brady Bunch house being for sale, what did he do? Well, he instantaneously went and did the inflation calculation on the Brady Bunch house. Yes, this is the house that was in the show, the Brady Bunch. A lot of us grew up with the Brady Bunch, right? All of them had hair of gold like their mother, the youngest one in curls. Hey, Cindy, that was the youngest one, right? Yeah, Cindy, and then there was Marcia, and who was the oldest one? I can't remember. And there was, anyway, whatever. Who cares? See, we get on these crazy tangents. Okay, so the Brady Bunch house is for sale. So check this out. Now, the problem with this house is it's such an iconic house that you really can't calculate the inflation rate. But I think you can calculate a little bit of it, because this house, back in 1973, the last time the house sold, and by the way, it has not sold yet. So remember, a list price represents what? Fantasy land. The sales price represents an appraisal, because the best appraisal you can have is the meeting of the minds of a ready, willing, and able seller along with a ready, willing, and able buyer. And when those two minds meet, you have, what do they call them in real estate? Comps. You have comps. You have an appraisal. You have the best real estate appraisal you can possibly get. Forget about what those appraisers say when they come out and do their inspection. That doesn't mean anywhere near as much as what a ready, willing, and able buyer and seller will do when they meet their minds. That is the ultimate appraisal. So, in 1973, the Brady Bunch house, the iconic Brady Bunch house, sold for $60,000. Okay, $60,000. And then now it is listed for $1.9 million. What's the problem here? Well, a few problems. The number one problem is it's an iconic house. So what's the premium for that, right? But your skeptical host here instantly went and calculated the inflation rate, because you'll hear those liars, liar, pants on fire, like Jim Cramer out there, or, hey, even Schiller, Robert Schiller, right? Nobel laureate behind the Case-Shiller Index, right? Wrote the Irrational Exuberance books. They don't tell you the whole story, these guys. They just don't tell you the whole story. But I'll tell you the whole story. They don't acknowledge income property as the multi-dimensional asset class that it is. They want to just say, hey, real estate keeps up with inflation, or it outperforms inflation a little bit, right? But, not in the case of the Brady Bunch house, that's for sure. Because guess what? $60,000 in January of 1973 has the same buying power in January of 2018, according to the official stats, as $349,000. $349,000. So clearly, this house has appreciated quite a bit faster than inflation. But, you could put a lot of other factors. One, it hasn't sold. That's the first problem. So maybe it'll sell for, I don't know, $1,600,000, $1,500,000. Maybe it'll sell for $1,900,000, $1,800,000. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe they're crazy and it won't even sell for $1,000,000. Who knows, right? But it'll probably sell somewhat close to list price, right? So let's assume that. Now, you take into account all of the other factors that have happened in these high-end areas that have pushed these prices beyond the beyond. But remember, you've got this situation where over time, and I know this is very hard to stay, it's very hard to keep your eye on the ball when things are crazy. When you're in the middle of tulip mania or Bitcoin mania, hey, listen, I was not recommending buying Bitcoin at any price, ever, right? I watched it go from, when did I first learn about it? I think it was about $80. I watched it go from $80 to when I bought my half a Bitcoin for about $400, up to close to $20,000, and now it's back down, under $6,000, right? Do you know how many people lost fortunes? Imagine if you bought at the peak of whatever the peak was, near 20 grand, right? And now it's worth less than six. I mean, you would have been killed. The same is true with the cyclical versus linear markets. Over time, you'll always get the good, solid performance in the linear market because you'll get the cash flow, and then you'll also get the more consistent appreciation because you don't give it all back in the down cycles. You give a little bit back. You just don't give back nearly as much as you do in the super high-end markets, right? The cyclical markets that whipsaw. And you get whiplash in those markets. And hey, if you time them right, you're going to do great. But I'm not going to pretend to be able to time them. So that's the deal. But that's just kind of interesting. I thought I'd share that little pop trivia with you. And gosh, we got a lot of other stuff to talk about. But you know what? We got to do our 10th show today. We got to talk about the Pope and the Caring Society. But while you're listening to this interview, if you are not driving, jogging, walking the dog, or anything like that, and you are at your computer or your mobile device, you need to go to jasonhartman.com and you need to buy your tickets for our upcoming Hawaii conference, Profits in Paradise. Yes, that conference is going to be awesome. It's a totally new conference, and we haven't launched a new event really since JHU in 2015. Jason Hartman University, our first one of those, was in San Diego back in 2015, a little over 3 years ago, and this is a new event. So make sure you're there in beautiful, gorgeous Hawaii the first week in November, and I think you'll like it very much. You've got super early bird pricing right now. He who hesitates is lost, as they say. Join us, be there, 2-day conference in Hawaii, and if you like, join us right after that for the Venture Alliance retreat in beautiful Kauai. So it's going to be a great time, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Let's get to our 10th show and talk about the Pope and the Caring Society. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert Whaples to the show. He is book review editor for the Economic History Association, research fellow at the Independent Institute, managing editor for the Independent Review, and professor of economics at Wake Forest University, and editor of the new book, Pope Francis and the Caring Society. Robert, welcome. How are you?
Thanks for having me on. I'm doing great today.
It's good to have you on. Good to have you on. So Pope Francis, this is quite really a new direction, isn't it, for the Catholic Church? I mean, sort of a very modern Pope, right?
In many ways, he's moving the church into some new directions, but it turns out that the church's history is, long and rich, and so especially when it comes to what the Pope's saying about the economy and also the environment and those kinds of things, actually not that groundbreaking, just maybe tacking the church back over in a direction that some of the earlier popes would have had, maybe a little less friendly to the market than his most immediate predecessors would be.
Okay, good. So what does he think about, give us some of maybe his worldview on capitalism, charitable giving, things like that?
Yeah, and so I think the best place you can find him talking about this is in the encyclical that came out a couple of years ago called Laudato Si, on the care of our common home. And while a lot of people think of it as his environmental encyclical, it's as much about the economy as it is about the environment. It's as much about the rich and the poor as about the earth itself. And so I think one way to frame the Pope's view on these things is to think about his background until just 5 years ago, he was living down in Argentina. And I think that gave him a little different view on the economy than we would have here. He describes himself as kind of allergic to all things economic, and you just don't see him being as supportive of a market system as some of his predecessors were. And I think that has a lot to do with his Argentine background. Argentina, if you went back a little more than a century ago, was one of the most successful economies in the world. It was up there in the top handful in terms of standards of living.
It's amazing what decades of corruption will do.
Their standards of living have gone up, as they have all over the world, because we have better technology and all that. But you were exactly right. The corporatist model, the Juan Perón, the Peronistas, which is a model where the government is totally intertwined with business, and to be successful in business, you need to be in league with the government. And so we would call that crony capitalism around here. I think that's what Pope Francis views as capitalism. And so, I would consider that kind of a misperception on his part, but you can understand why, coming from where he does. We always have to be worried about crony capitalism, having the government be the one determining the winners and losers, but it isn't really the rule. And a better functioning economy has one where firms really do compete for customers to deliver them the best products at the best prices, and then much more of the benefits go along to the consumers there. And standards of living are a lot higher, and you solve tough problems like absolute poverty so much more quickly when you adopt a more free market-oriented economy.
Okay, so I just want to make sure this is clear for myself and then, of course, the listeners. So you're saying that because he has this somewhat like tainted view of capitalism because of the Argentine model, where it's much more, it's, we complain about crony capitalism here in the States, but, God, it's worse there. So that would make him less capitalistic in his statements and his worldview, right?
I think that's exactly right, that he just kind of has a natural gut reaction to this thing that a market economy isn't going to solve your problems very well, because I think he's seen a market economy that just wasn't a strong market economy.
Right.
It was one that had handcuffs on.
Yeah.
And so one thing to compare him with is John Paul II, who grew up in Poland under communism. So he saw how bad communism worked, and he said more supportive things of a democratic capitalist system than like just about any other pope ever has. And you can see how their backgrounds would have affected that. Now, one thing that economists would say if they had a chance to sit down and chat with Pope Francis is that, in fact, the various types of economies around the world that are moving toward the free market have generated so much economic growth in recent decades that it has wiped out a much absolute poverty that existed around the world. The World Bank calculates that over 1 billion people in the last few decades have been lifted out of absolute poverty, and they define that people living on less than $1.90 a day. And so as China has moved to market mechanisms, India, countries in Africa, Indonesia, big places all over the world have done this, we have seen that, they copied what we did in this country and other countries did, capturing the power of a market economy, people working together, and they've seen just absolute poverty melt away. And so that's a wonderful success that I don't think the Pope acknowledges as much as you would like him to.
Yeah, definitely agree with you there. So connect the economy with the environment, if you would. Of course, it's extremely connected, but connected in the Pope's worldview, if you would.
I guess in the Pope's worldview, business can be a noble profession if directed to the right ends, but he worries that, in fact, it gets directed toward the wrong ends. And, people trying to just line their own pockets and earn big profits, and in the process, maybe just putting their costs off onto other people if they can get away with it. And that obviously happens. And when you see that happening in the environment, it can be very destructive.
Absolutely. And in so many other ways, if I may interrupt you for a moment, I just want to bring this up to the listeners because I think this word that I'm about to say, and of course you know the word, is not used enough in our dialogue about the economy, the environment, or many other parts of life. And the word is externalities. Externalities. We really need to start talking about externalities more often. So in the kind of context we're using it, of course, you know, the company goes out and they do their manufacturing and they pollute the river, right? Polluting the river is not a cost of doing business directly to the company, but it's an externality and a cost that we all bear because the river's polluted, right? And someone has to clean it, hopefully.
Exactly.
But there are externalities in so many other areas of life. I mean, you know, the little pet peeves that I have in my life, like leaf blowers, one of the worst inventions in human history, I believe, is leaf blowers.
You hear that whining sound for a half an hour
and
coming
the dust
from a block away, and you're like, stop
and the
it.
dust and the pollution, it's terrible, yeah. And loud motorcycles and loud cars, these are externalities. Other people bear the cost of them. So back to the Pope. I just wanted to go on that little tangent for a moment.
Yeah, and so I think that Pope Francis is entirely right that many individuals, many businesses will push their costs off onto other people if they can get away with it. But what a successful market economy does is make sure that they don't get away with it, right? And so we pass laws that say polluters have to pay. And you know what? It turns out I'm a polluter too. I've got lights on in my office, and there's a place not too many miles away from here that's burning coal to create the electricity.
Right.
And luckily they've got scrubbers and things in their smokestacks, so there's not too much soot that comes out. But I'm the one paying them to do that, right?
Yep.
And so when an economist says the solution to this problem is to make the polluter pay, they don't just mean the businesses, they mean the consumers as well. They share those costs, and it will depend on the forces of competition who bears those costs. But in fact, what you need to do to solve an environmental problem like that is sit down and make polluters pay. That can be through a tax if there's no other way, but another way that usually works much more successfully is to create a property right so that somebody owns something and then has an incentive to take care of it. Now, owning the air, that's a hard one.
Yeah.
But
the
think
land
about
is
owning
easier.
land, owning water, those kinds of things. And so here's an example that one of the authors in our book brings out. You can see from hundreds of miles up in space a difference between one end of the island of Hispaniola and the other end. That's the island in the Caribbean that's got Haiti on one end and the Dominican Republic on the other.
Right, the DR is much better off than Haiti,
It's just
right?
greener on one side of the island than the other.
Yeah.
And the reason goes back to decades of corrupt governments in Haiti where nobody had a secure property right.
Yeah.
You owned your land, sort of, but the government could come on and grab stuff. Their cronies could come in and grab stuff. They could clear-cut your land or something.
Absolutely.
So what did you do? You cut the trees down before they got a chance, or maybe you didn't cut the trees down before they got the chance.
Yeah.
But everything just kind of gets cut down, and then there's all this erosion, and the whole environment is out of whack because they didn't have an honest government that defined and enforced property.
Okay, so I'm so glad, Robert, you brought this up. Let me ask you a couple questions about this. I agree with you philosophically, no question. And I remember reading a Greenpeace magazine, and it was, several years after the Soviet Union had finally collapsed, and it just profiled, and the pictures were astonishing. They were just terrible. Yeah. The birth defects, the pollution, the awful
There was more environmental degradation within the Soviet Union and has been in communist countries than any other place in the whole world.
And the thesis being, what you say, is that when people don't own something, they don't care about it. And I agree, how well do you take care of your own car versus a rental car? How well do you take care of a rented house versus your own house? Of course that's true. But, if Monsanto or Dow Chemical, if they want to buy a big plot of land next to their factory and, pollute it, I mean, that might actually be a good equation for them. That even though they own it, the ownership society concept is true and philosophically valid. It just might be an expedient business decision. It does seem like, and as much of a libertarian as I think I am, it seems like we do have to have some some tax or some kind of regulation is a tax. But I don't know. What are your comments on that?
I think you are right. In fact, there are times when it makes sense if there's a product we really want and it's messy to make it, the mess has to go somewhere. And so it makes sense that you would give them a place that they could put it on their own land rather than dumping it on somebody else's land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what's really interesting is if you just look at the most basic measures of environmental quality, how much junk there is in the air that you breathe, how clean is the water that you actually get to drink, those kinds of things. What economists have discovered is a distinct pattern that you see for just about every pollutant, and that is as economies grow from the very, low agrarian kind of level, the pollution levels start to go up, but then they peak and they start to go down once countries get rich enough. How do they get rich like that? Well, they're the market economies. And so the market economies get richer and richer, and then we can afford to clean things up. We demand to clean things up. Mm-hmm. We have the spare resources with which we can clean things up.
Right.
And so we've got about the cleanest air in the world around here in this country. It's far cleaner than it was a few decades ago when I was growing up. I remember before there were catalytic converters on cars.
Yeah. I remember too.
And things like that, just feeling it in my lungs.
Oh yeah, you go to other. Well, the leaf blowers don't have catalytic converters, and these dumb little golf carts running around Belize, and I've been to 81 countries, and it's just disgusting how polluted they are.
Yeah.
But in a sense, couldn't one argue that the U.S., through its trade policy, which is, we're seeing that reverse now, through its trade policy has exported the pollution to China and created an externality? As Kennedy said, we all breathe the same air, right? It's, I don't know, have we just moved the pollution to Beijing?
There is, a degree of validity to that argument, but of course what also needs to be brought in is that sometimes people are willing to make trades like that with you. China receives money for the products that we buy from them, raising their standards of living, and they have, I guess, collectively said that we're okay getting dirtier air at the same time that we're getting richer. But even if they're not collectively saying that, even if it's kind of forced on them from above, China is now at the level basically of a mid-income country. The richer areas along the coast are now above the world average and moving up toward first world standards. And in fact, the environment in many Chinese cities is now getting cleaner.
Right, it's getting attention.
Look at objective measures of this, right? There's just the total amount of soot in the air and those kinds of things is going down. And so they've turned that corner in an important way.
Yeah. Good point.
Okay, my wife and I have been binge watching lately old Mission Impossible episodes.
I watch those.
So they're from the late 1960s and early 1970s, and you see a car driving off, and there's
disgusting.
all this stuff that comes out of the tailpipe. You see planes taking off, and there's all this junk coming out. It's such a change in the 40 or 50 years since that happened. It's just you can spot it with your eyes.
My mom used to tell me about how businessmen would go to work in the morning with a white shirt. Yeah, and at the end of the day, it would be gray in many American cities.
They had detachable collars back in the old days. That's the part sticking out above your vest or whatever. Yeah. And you just take the collar off and put a new one on midway through the day or something like that so you could have a clean collar.
That's just incredible, yeah. So the point being, and we agree on that, look, capitalism is good for the environment, but the folks on the left listening would argue that that's because of government regulation. And I remember when I was in a group called Leadership Tomorrow when I lived in Southern California, we spent an entire day at the AQMD, the Air Quality Management District in I believe, Yorba Linda, California, or Diamond Bar. And I remember the person speaking to us, she proudly got up and said, she spoke to our group and said, we don't take any taxpayer money here. And they had these gorgeous offices with brand new, beautiful furniture. And I thought, wow, this place is pretty posh. And she proudly said, we don't take any taxpayer money. And I said, well, where do you get your revenue? And she said, by levying fines against companies that don't comply with things like making it a longer walk if you don't have a fuel-efficient car in the parking lot. You have to park further away if you don't carpool, if you don't have a fuel-efficient car, et cetera. So, they would fine big companies, thousands of dollars a day, like in exorbitant fines. Of course, that passes through to the consumer.
Of course, a fine is a tax by another name.
Of course it is. Yes, I know. Yeah.
And so the point is that there are sometimes we do need to get together and act collectively.
Right.
Okay? And so, government needs to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. What economists have generally found, though, is that government has had a track record, especially the federal government, when they put these regulations in place, they do so in a very inefficient way. They could have had other regulations, other rules that reduced the pollution the same amount at a much, much lower cost.
Right.
Because they want to call the shots on everything rather than just give you the incentive to reduce the things and you find out the cheapest way to do it, right? Like the walking from the parking lot example.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's very important to realize that government is part of the solution, but maybe not a perfect part of the solution. If you look at the trend in many of the levels of pollutants in the United States, before and after the federal government passed their Clean Air or Clean Whatever acts, the pollution levels were already coming down, and the trend didn't really change too much when the federal government got into the game.
Interesting. Yeah, I can't imagine government being inefficient. That's just really... I'm joking, of course.
Well, the incentives just aren't there.
Yeah, right.
It's not part of your bottom line. Yeah. And, bureaucrats have a hard time. I've talked with bureaucrats about issues like this, and I can empathize with them. They just don't have the same incentives. They have to please higher-ups in different ways than people in business who please them by earning more profits and things like that. And so you can see why they often end up implementing rules that aren't going to work that way.
Well, speaking of bureaucrats, let's wrap up with, I want to ask you about one other chapter in the book, the uneven playing fields, markets and oligarchy. What about that, and where does the Catholic Church and the Pope come in on that?
Yeah, and so that's an interesting chapter in the book. That's by Gabriel Martinez, who's down at Ave Maria College down in Florida. And so I would say of all the chapters in the book, it's kind of the one that goes out of its way to take Pope Francis on his own terms and not try to be the outsider economist being critical and kind of showing him what we can teach him. And I think a number of the other places in the book, the authors, including myself in the introduction, point out that we have a lot of things that we can learn from what Pope Francis says. And I think the most important one of them, in my opinion, would be this. Fans of the free market, many economists, often take a completely materialistic view of things, as though spiritual matters are of no concern whatsoever. And that especially comes through when you kind of open up an economics textbook and it just gives you a blunt assertion that we're going to run with from now on. More is better. Economists would say more is better. And Pope Francis says, you know what? I just don't buy that. In fact, more can be very bad for you. You know that you could eat too much food. You know that you could, you could consume too much. Sure. He points out that so many of us have kind of traded God in for mammon. And we're caught up, as he says, in this just whirlwind of consumption. We've got to have the latest thing, and then this phone is 2 years old, and you got to turn it in or get rid of it and get the even newer, spiffier one. And we just turn our lives over to these things. The lesser lights of the world drown out the eternal light. And that is such an important point, that we people in prosperous societies are not using our economy to its greatest potential. We don't have to be using the economy to just be getting more and more junk that we don't really need. We could be using it for higher purposes.
Yeah, well, that's a great point, and I'm glad that you kind of closed on that note, because what's interesting about it is the way the consumer society was created in America. It goes back to the Torches of Freedom guy, what's his name? I can't think of it right now, that really created modern PR and advertising in Madison Avenue before Mad Men. Gosh, his name's going to come to me right after this interview, but where the women smoke the cigarettes, and you know who I'm talking about, I'm sure. Before that, Americans, like other people around the world, were not they didn't always have to have the newest, better thing. The consumer society, really, you can see like right where it changed. It was, it was within a decade, there was this shift, this growth at all costs. That's the way the economy is set up. You just got to sell more widgets and more widgets, no matter how much of a steward of the environment you are.
Whether or not you need them, yeah.
Yeah, you're going to create externalities. And what do we do about that? Is there even a solution?
If there is a solution, it's not a top-down solution, It's not like somebody would get elected to office on a platform like that and then be able to implement some policies. It's from the soul out, right? It's a person at an individual level saying, I don't need this extra stuff. I don't need to work this extra time to get this extra thing. Or maybe if I am going to work more, I don't need to take it and buy something to show up my neighbor or catch up with my neighbor. I could use it for more noble purposes. I could donate my excess funds to somebody who needs them far more than I do.
Yeah.
I could just reorient my life so that I don't need to use all the resources because I'm not in this giant rat race with other people. And so really, it's one that you've got to do you and God together rather than you and Uncle Sam together,
Mm-hmm. By the way, the name I was looking for was Edward Bernays, who really invented modern public relations in 1929. And that's when they... look it up, folks. If you have not read about this or watched any of the documentaries about Edward Bernays and Torches of Freedom, it's quite fascinating. And so there was this shift, right at the Great Depression when companies had to figure out how to get people to want stuff they didn't need. And boy, have we doubled down on that one more than once.
And there's a lot of human creativity and intelligence that was harnessed for that project, and maybe could have been harnessed for better.
No question. No question about that. No question about that. Well, hey, it was great talking with you about the book. I wish you a lot of success with it. Give out your website and tell people, where they can find you.
Go to the Independent Institute's website. So it's www.independent.org, and you will find this book there and all sorts of other wonderful things that the Institute does.
Excellent stuff. Robert, thanks for joining us.
It was my privilege to be on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.